Ahoy-hoy shippies! Surely you remember my video from last year covering the 5 greatest sea battles from the golden age of piracy, and my promise to make a similar episode tackling land battles, if there was interest in it. Well, yes, there was interest, and I have let my crew starve for long enough without even a morsel to sustain their ravenous appetites. Of course, there was a reason for it. I wanted to make the episode on their land tactics before this one, so that we could better understand how they were able to fight these 5 epic battles. One of the issues with studying pirate land battles, and pirate battles overall, is that individual scenarios are often poorly documented. The written narrative of a battle might only consist of a few lines. For most of their engagements, we do not know of troop movements and placements, particular stratagems deployed, only who won and who didn't. Part of the reason for this limited documentation is because, just like most sea battles, pirate land battles were underwhelming. Whilst they were capable fighters, they preferred not to fight, and just have their targets surrender the loot. So Buccaneers would primarily strike at targets that were unsuspecting and unprepared, take them by surprise. One thing I didn't mention in the tactics episode is that Spanish forces had to be divided over a large area, meaning that each particular location usually only had a few defenders, with even important cities seldom having a garrison of more than 300 or 400. Buccaneers might encounter as few as 50 or even 10. Of course, if these defenders had good fortifications and came prepared, they could make a fierce resistance. This will be shown in the first entry. This poor documentation might make it seem that it was difficult for me to compile a list. And on one hand it was difficult. Very few of these battles fit in with the sort of dream scenario portrayed in the previous episode, where the Buccaneers defeat a larger army with superior tactics and claim the day, and I had to be somewhat creative and pick battles that are perhaps a bit unconventional. In the end, the purpose of this channel is to tell interesting stories from pirate history, and that doesn't mean that the Buccaneers have to win. So the list will cover some of their defeats, and even a battle which is very important to Buccaneer history, but did not involve them directly. By thinking in this unconventional manner, I was actually able to compile a list of 10 battles, but the title says 5, and I cannot be bothered to make an episode that long, so if there is enough interest in this one, tell me in the comments, and I'd be eager to make a follow-up. And perhaps we'll see it next year. It's not really that long, to be honest. Without further ado. The first battle might seem entirely out of place in this ranking, because it did not involve Buccaneers or pirates, the English attack on San Domingo in 1655. This was an expedition organized in England and consisted of English soldiers and sailors. However, the reason I picked it was because this battle was very much the prequel to the English age of buccaneering between 1655 and 1671. Many, if not most, of the survivors of this debacle would become buccaneers. Many of them did have criminal backgrounds, so it seems reasonable. The expedition had piratical intentions, showing us how piracy and buccaneering was deployed in early empire building. Its many failures served as a hard lesson to improve the campaign and battlefield conduct of the Buccaneers. And it shows how dangerous and competent the Spanish opponent actually was if you played into their hands. After the English Civil Wars, the newfound English Commonwealth was strapped for cash, and Lord Protector Oliver Cromwell devised the idea to go on a colonial adventure to the Americas. By colonial adventure, I mean that he wanted to send over ships to steal gold and silver from the Spanish. If England could capture one of the larger islands, like Cuba or Puerto Rico, they could use it as a staging ground to attack the galleons. This island could also be used as a dumping ground for Scottish and Irish troublemakers, turning them into productive citizens by working them to death on sugar plantations. It was really a win-win. Well, not for the Spanish and not for the Irish. There was also a religious element to the scheme. Oliver was a devout Christian and believed his Commonwealth stood as the Protestant vanguard against Catholicism. He corresponded with New England preachers, who argued that stealing from the Spanish would be to dry up the river Euphrates, fulfilling a biblical prophecy that heralded the second coming of Jesus and the end of the world. By conquering Spanish America, England could also evangelize among the native heathens and protect them from the supposed cruelty of their Spanish overlords. Cromwell was a brilliant general who had organized his forces into the new model army. First to standardize the iconic red coat, they fought with both zeal and discipline, and their reputation of invincibility earned them the name Ironsides. However, Cromwell wasn't able to find many veterans for the expedition and had to fill the regiments with the scum of the earth, many of them convicts pulled out from the can. Others were Catholic Irish, and there was even a small regiment of reformados, disgraced veterans and gentlemen. There were a lot of decent and even excellent officers in the expedition, but many of them either disliked their men or were disliked by the men. The assigned general, Robert Venables, was somewhat arrogant and not much of a people person, who didn't like to consult his council or take many of their warnings. There was also an issue of supply. Army logisticians could make a hefty profit by taking the money given to them to buy necessities, then pocket most of it, and then acquire low-quality stuff for what was left. The expedition was seriously short on weapons, ammunition, slow match for the matchlocks, armor, food, water, and even the shafts for the pikes. The fleet of around 34 ships departed in December of 1654, arriving in Barbados in January of the next year. Here they recruited local indentured servants to bolster their ranks, and the total force of soldiers, sailors, and officers soon numbered close to 10,000. Again, these servants were considered rubbish, and Barbados viewed as a dunghill. They resupplied, recruited, and drew up a plan of attack. Oliver had given them considerable leeway in which target to assault, perhaps too much leeway, and they decided on the island of Hispaniola and its capital of San Domingo, the oldest city in the Caribbean. They arrived in April of 1655 and decided to divide their forces into a larger and smaller contingent and make landfall near the rivers west of the city. One of the early problems encountered was that the plan had leaked out, even before they set sail. The Spanish had been notified, and all of their Caribbean possessions were on high alert, Hispaniola included. They had managed to muster an army of 2,400, consisting of regular soldiers, militiamen, light cavalry, and the so-called cow killers. These were former criminals, pardoned and deported to the colonies, where they hunted wild cattle using only a spear. They were deadly proficient in the use of this weapon. Firearms were somewhat scarce, mainly consisting of weak and short-barreled arquebuses. San Domingo was also protected by several forts, kitted out with heavy cannons. The first days of the campaign were confusing for the English. They wandered somewhat aimlessly without any guides or intelligence about the country. Since the army was poorly supplied, they intended to live off the land, but the local food was alien to them. The Spanish had also set fire to their own fields to drive away the cattle, depriving the army of meat. Even when they found fresh water in the rivers, the soldiers had not been issued flasks to fill, and many of the water sources were contaminated, leading to an outbreak of dysentery. Venables himself was eventually afflicted, and this horrible disease, in which you basically poo yourself to death, would claim the highest death toll, not a musket, cannon, or spear. The days were hot with no shade to be found, and at night the temperatures would drop rapidly, with the men having no tents to sleep under. After a few days, the wet season arrived, and they had to sleep under rain. They fought the occasional skirmish with the Spanish, but no proper engagement until a local Irishman guided them to the city, now fortified and prepared for their coming. Here it is necessary to discuss the deployment of the English army. The soldiers were divided into regiments, each consisting of 1,000 men, led by its officer and his respective flag. I do not know what flags they carried during the expedition, but here are a couple from the English Civil War, and they would have been similar. At the head of the army marched the Forlorn Hope. As you might recall from my episode on Buccaneer tactics, the Forlorn was supposed to scout ahead, take the brunt of ambushes, engage the enemy first, and lead the charge. They consisted of 50 men from each regiment, selected by lot, and numbered a total of 500. They were followed by the 55 reformados, the disgraced veterans and gentlemen. Behind them marched a small regiment of 100 fusiliers, elite soldiers armed with flintlocks. This new weapon allowed them to reload and fire 2 or 3 times faster than the matchlock given to the regular troops, making them excellent for frontline shock tactics. Behind the Reformados came 2 troops of Barbadian cavalrymen, followed by 2 regular regiments, one led by Venables, then the Sea Regiment, D'Oyly's regiment, followed by the artillery, a mortar and 2 small cannons, and then the remaining 4 regiments. On the 17th of April, the English were marching down the road, 14 or 15 paces wide, under beating drums and flying banners. They entered a woodland, where the Spanish fell upon them from the scrub. 30 arquebusiers fired a volley, and the fusiliers fired back. Before the English could reload, the cowkillers sprang forth and broke the fusiliers' formation. The Reformados stood their ground, holding out until the Sea Regiment came to their rescue. According to one account, Venables hid behind a tree. According to another, he had been cut off. Spanish reinforcements arrived, with 50 arquebusiers firing 3 volleys, the third killing Captain Jennings of the Reformados. Note that these volleys were probably not one single burst, but the shooters standing somewhat loosely and discharging at their own pace. The Sea Regiment returned fire and ran them off. They pursued the Spanish through the woods and into an open plain in front of the city. Here stood a small fort called Pozo del Rey, which fired its cannons at the attackers, forcing them back. This first engagement had resulted in 70 English casualties and 7 Spaniards wounded. The English demanded the city surrender, but lacking the siege equipment or artillery, had to pull back to an occupied plantation. Along the way, Spanish scouts found discarded equipment and the peels of local oranges, devoured by the thirsty, starving soldiers. Had the Spanish not retreated but pushed their advantage, they might have inflicted devastating casualties. But either side was unaware of the strength of the other. The next few days were spent recuperating and resupplying from the fleet, including the arrival of a siege mortar. More men continued falling to disease, and the attack was resumed on the 24th of April. The fleet attempted a bombardment of San Domingo, but did no damage. Lacking draft animals, the soldiers were forced to carry all of their supplies, all the while sustaining themselves on half rations. The next day, they pressed on to the city, with no orders given about defending their flanks, despite their previous experiences with the enemy ambushing them. Meanwhile, the Spanish had been preparing. They had cleared away some of the brush to give the artillery a clear line of fire, but corpses still littered the field. It must have been a morbid sight. At 1 p.m., the English were spotted, and the Spanish soldiers ordered to lie flat. When the enemy passed the forts, they opened fire with round shot loaded over case, scattershot, but did no damage. The arquebusiers fired a volley, and the English replied, killing several Spanish officers and men. Before they could reload, the Spanish cavalry charged. The English, having been supplied with bad pikes from Barbados, and lacking the counter-cavalry training, were unable to stop the attack. The Fusiliers and Forlorn Hope were routed, leaving only the Reformados to hold their ground. Out of the initial 55, only 18 would survive. The fleeing mass disrupted the English cavalry and regiments, and though some officers tried to rally them, they were swiftly dispatched by the Spanish. Once again, the Sea Regiment came to the rescue, opening up their ranks to allow their comrades escape, before closing again and forcing the attackers back into the woods. The Spanish pulled back to the city, and Venables prepared an assault. The army stopped within musket shot of the fort and waited for orders, all the while enemy cannons fired at them. Every shot claimed 8 or 9 men. They brought up the mortar and tried to neutralize the forts, but the Spanish concentrated their fire on it and inflicted more casualties. Spanish reinforcements were brought up to engage the English rearguard, the latter having the advantage. When darkness came, the army retreated. It was a complete disaster, with something between 600 to 800 men having perished, the Spanish only having lost around 30. In the coming days, hundreds, even thousands of Englishmen would perish by disease, not to mention the horses and equipment left behind. The soldiers were traumatized, and the sound of land crabs clattering made them jump and scream, thinking it was the Spanish marching upon them. The ragged survivors embarked and left. They sailed south and managed to conquer poorly defended and sparsely inhabited Jamaica, thus beginning a new chapter in English colonial and pirate history. The disastrous Western design had remarkable consequences both in the history of pirates and the British Empire. It led to the conquest of Jamaica, England's most profitable colony, and which would become a base for Buccaneer assaults on the Main. England found it to be more effective to sponsor the Buccaneers than to launch their own expeditions, at least for a few decades, until the Buccaneers became troublesome. As for the Buccaneers, many of them were former veterans of this expedition. For a while they settled as garrison troops in Jamaica, but were reluctant to become farmers. When captains and ships arrived offering them an opportunity to go and plunder, they happily agreed. Plunder had been a driving motivator for joining the design, and many were former criminals. That is besides the lessons they learned in strategy and tactics. For one, they learned how dangerous the Spanish actually were, but also how to counter them. They had to take the city by surprise, before reinforcements could be mustered into a large army. The Spanish were bad shooters and had few guns, but had excellent cavalry and melee troops, so the Buccaneers learned how to counter them. Matchlocks and pikes were proven useless, so the Buccaneers adopted a more flexible and reliable flintlock. Cavalry and artillery were abandoned, they did not care much for naval bombardments, and gathering intelligence and reliable guides was vital. In many cases, the Buccaneers knew as much about their target as the defenders did. The disaster at San Domingo was very much the prequel to the age of buccaneering. The veterans of the design would join forces with hunters and privateers, becoming the Buccaneers as we know them. At Jamaica, they rallied under charismatic officers, many holding commissions against the Spanish. Most notable was Henry Morgan, once a militia captain in Jamaica that had quickly risen to become the greatest Buccaneer commander. England and Spain were negotiating a peace treaty in the late 1660s, but after a string of brutal Buccaneer attacks, many committed by Morgan, the Spanish retaliated. Corsairs launched forays onto Jamaica itself, and rumors of a full-out reconquest had been brewing for a few years. Even though Governor Modiford wanted to keep the peace, he commissioned Morgan to launch a preemptive strike on Panama, one of the richest cities of the Spanish Main. Morgan was given the right to issue his own privateering commissions to subordinate commanders, and mustered an initial fleet of 11 ships and 600 men, and sailed next to Ile Avache, a popular pirate haunt, hoping to grow his company. Messages were sent out across the Caribbean to notify the Buccaneers of his impending operation, while hunters were sent out to gather provisions. It is not entirely certain how many men he managed to muster in the end. The official record says 1,846, but it may have been over 2,000. These men were veteran buccaneers, old and new soldiers, Jamaican militiamen, and hunters from the island of Hispaniola, proficient marksmen. 2/3 were English, whereas 1/3 was French. But there was also a smattering of Dutchmen and other nationalities as well. One of the participants was a witch brought aboard to prophesize. The fleet departed from Ile Avache on the 18th of December, 1670, and arrived on the island of Santa Catalina 6 days later. Evidence points to the garrison surrendering without a fight, after the Buccaneers agreed to fight a mock battle with them instead, in order to avoid both death and disgrace. Catalina was used as a forward base to attack Panama from. The Buccaneers gathered provisions and guides familiar with the Panama region. Their next target was Castle San Lorenzo on the river Chagres, situated on the Darien Isthmus, not far from Panama. Morgan dispatched Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Bradley, 3 ships and 470 men to take it. The castle was situated on a rocky peninsula, consisting of wooden palisades packed with earth, and shielded by a palm leaf roof. Cannons guarded the river entrance, so Bradley landed on the shore and marched to the castle through the woods. Having heard of his coming, the Spanish prepared an ambush, but Bradley and his men went so speedily through an alternate route that they circumvented it entirely. When the castle came within view, Bradley divided his force in 2 and made a direct assault. Though his shooters were able to pick off a few targets, they sustained heavy casualties and were forced to retreat. At twilight, Bradley launched a second assault. This time, the divided force attacked 2 different sections of the castle, forcing the defenders to split their attention. The Buccaneers now had a cover of darkness, whereas the defenders were highlighted by standing against the setting sun. The sharpshooters suppressed fire from the walls, allowing the grenadiers to close in and lob their explosives over the ramparts. These set fire to the thatched roof, which collapsed over the defenders and caused a panic. As the Castellan attempted to extinguish the fire, a bronze cannon blew up, tearing a breach in the palisade that allowed the Buccaneers to enter. One grenadier managed to land his load in the magazine, destroying the reserve arms of the garrison. Some managed to escape and row down the river, whilst the others remained. Both sides took a pause during the night, getting some manner of rest, before the pirates resumed the attack at first light. Twice they were driven back by a cannon, loaded with musket balls and fired point blank. But at last, a French contingent managed to enter the castle, slaying the defiant Castellan and crying, "Victoire! Victoire!" The Buccaneers had sustained 30 dead and 70 wounded, among them Bradley himself, who passed away shortly after. Captain Richard Norman took command of the castle, repairing the damages using slave labor taken from Santa Catalina, and erecting a garrison of some 400 pirates. They hoisted a flag of England to invite Morgan and his fleet, but the flagship and several other vessels were wrecked on a reef. 10 men perished, along with the witch. Nonetheless, most of the men and provisions were saved, and Morgan proceeded upriver in a fleet of smaller boats and canoes. They found some stockades along the way, but upon seeing the size of Morgan's army, the defenders had pulled back. When the river became too hard to navigate, the army made landfall and marched through the woodland, hacking their way forward with machetes and cutlasses. Morgan decided to leave their provisions behind, intending to live off the land. However, their noisome advance scared off all the game, and the Spanish deployed scorched earth to deprive the Buccaneers. They were soon reduced to a starving rabble, and the Spanish prepared ambushes, primarily consisting of native archers. However, the Buccaneers were prepared for them. The main force marched in a regular column, but the flanks and front were protected by skirmishers, who were easily able to repel the ambushers. After a 5 days' march without food, they came upon the Pacific coast, where they found some horses and cattle, butchering and devouring them, barely cooked. Allowing his men a few hours of rest, Morgan then proceeded to the city of Panama. When the tiled roofs and spires came within view, the men threw their hats in the air, and Morgan ordered them to set up camp and rest for the night. The Spanish were in a bad position. Their ambushes had failed, the city had no walls, and the governor lay ill with fever. The only remaining option was to pray for victory and beat the pirates in the open field outside of the city. Civilians and religious folk were evacuated along with the treasures of the city and all of the boats and ships. Don Juan, commander of the Spanish forces, had mustered 1,200 infantrymen, mostly poorly trained militiamen, only 600 armed with short-range arquebuses, most with lances and melee weapons, and many of them were drunk on the day of the battle. 300 or so were white Spaniards, the rest black or colored. Though the city had 3 cannons, Don Juan did not bring them out for whatever reason, and his biggest asset were the 2 troops of 200 horsemen each, totaling to 400 cavalrymen. Having initially camped on a hill, he moved his army out on a flat plain where he believed the cavalry would be more useful, and where the footmen could see him on his horse and be inspired. They were deployed in a single line 6 ranks deep, with the cavalry on the flanks. Morgan's army was divided into squadrons of 300 men, each flying a green banner with a white dot corresponding to the squadron's number. The vanguard, primarily consisting of Hispaniola hunters, was led by Lawrence Prince and John Morris, behind whom came Morgan's right wing, and Edward Collier's left wing. The rear guard was led by a newcomer, Colonel Bledry Morgan, no relation. Henry Morgan sent the vanguard to take the undefended hill, hoping to use it to outflank the enemy. Don Juan saw this and sent his cavalry forward to disperse them. But the hunters were expert sharpshooters, and each man picked off one of the leading horses, forcing the rest to wheel right and out of danger. With the hill conquered, the right and left wings swung towards it. As they disappeared into a gully, some of the eager Spaniards thought they were running from the field, and eagerly charged without orders. Excitement soon spread across the ranks, with the officers unable to control them. Don Juan decided to seize the moment and joined his men in the wild charge. It was then that the right and left wing came down the hill, and seeing the Spaniards charging them, gave a single, devastating volley. About 100 Spaniards dropped, and excitement was exchanged for panic. They turned their backs and ran. Some officers tried shooting their own men, but it was no use, and Don Juan, who lingered for a while, was soon convinced to retreat. A few men turned around to fight again, but were swiftly dispatched by the Buccaneers' fire. The Spanish made a last-ditch effort to repel the enemy when they sent a stampede of cows against them. The sharpshooters picked off the herders, and the cows were soon forced to turn, retreating along with the mass of Spaniards. Following in hot pursuit, the Buccaneers drew their cutlasses and hacked down any laggards. By 9 a.m., they had lost 15 of their own, as 400 or 500 Spanish bodies littered the field. It was a devastating victory. The Buccaneers rushed into the city, where they met some minor resistance from barricades and defenders in the streets. However, these soon retreated, and the cannons were found to be spiked. Not long after, a series of explosions were heard. Fleeing citizens could be heard shouting, "Fuego! Fuego!" as militiamen ran from building to building with burning torches. The governor had ordered the city to be set aflame. Morgan had won, but he would claim no bounty. Plunder was scarce, few denizens remained, the destroyed city could not be ransomed, and most of the treasure had been spirited away. His men were outraged, and some believed they had been cheated. The company split up shortly thereafter, many going on their own privateering cruises. Since England and Spain had signed a peace treaty shortly before Morgan's initial departure, he and Governor Modiford were sent back to England and imprisoned. However, both were eventually pardoned, and Morgan instituted as Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica. Morgan's army was the largest ever assembled by a pirate, and his battle the largest ever fought. Even still, it was far from a success. Nonetheless, it was where many later Buccaneers would cut their teeth, some of whom we'll encounter later on in the video. But before then, we will tackle an engagement fought before then. Many of Morgan's men were veterans of François l'Olonnais, one of the great Buccaneer commanders before Morgan's heyday. His greatest success was the taking of Maracaibo in 1666, which is a notable engagement for the tactics deployed by l'Olonnais, but also for how the battle was documented. L'Olonnais is a filibuster shrouded in mystery. There are many legends about him, stories of revenge, of utmost brutality, with most of them recorded and possibly conjured by A.O Exquemelin. And all we know for certain is that by 1666, he was one of the most notable commanders on the island of Tortuga. Here he mustered an army of 440 men, and a small fleet of 8 vessels. His plan was to take the city of Maracaibo in modern-day Venezuela, allowing him access to Lake Maracaibo and all of the targets on its shores. Having prisoners familiar with the area, he was well supplied with intelligence. On their way there, the fleet managed to capture several Spanish prizes, before eventually landing on a beach close to Maracaibo, intending to conquer the defenses on the mouth of the lake. These were feeble, consisting only of 16 cannons surrounded by several gabions, with a ramp of earth thrown against them to shelter the men inside. Arne and his vanguard overran the fortifications, incurring no losses. By hoisting their colors, they signaled for the ships to enter the lake, as they sabotaged the defenses by burning the gun carriages and spiking the cannons. The next day, they assaulted the city itself. The ships provided a barrage while the main force made landfall in their canoes. However, fire was not returned. As it turned out, the fleeing Spanish had alerted the city, telling them that an army of 2,000 pirates had arrived, making everyone flee with their riches. However, they had left behind their food and alcohol, allowing the pirates to have their fill. They had lived on sea rations and with barely any booze for close to a month. For a pirate, this was nigh unbearable. Each crew occupied a house in the center of town, with the col du garde erected in the church. Guards were posted, and a troop of 500 was sent out to find the refugees. They managed to capture a number of men, women, and children, torturing them to reveal the location of treasure. Arne apparently drew his cutlass and hacked the Spaniard to pieces in front of the others, saying he would do the same to each and every one of them should he not tell him what they knew. One of them relented and promised to show him where the other Spaniards had hid. But those in hiding realized that the pirates would learn of their location, so every day they moved to a different spot and managed to avoid detection. After 2 weeks of occupying Maracaibo, Arne proceeded to nearby Gibraltar, the center of the cacao trade. Gibraltar had been alerted and reinforced by 400 soldiers and 400 armed locals, totaling to a force of 800. They were led by the governor himself, a veteran of the 80 Years' War, who erected a battery of 20 cannons along the shoreline and a redoubt of 8. The pirates saw these entrenchments, but Arne promised his council that the greater the fight, the greater the plunder, and that he himself would lead the vanguard. If anyone would prove a coward, he'd shoot them himself. At dawn, the Buccaneers made landfall. They took each other by the hand and swore an oath to stand each other by, Arne declaring, "Alors mes frères, suivez-moi et ne faites point les lâches." Come on, my brothers, follow me, and don't be cowards. Then they marched. Following a guide, they came upon a road which had been blocked, and were forced to wade through a swampland where the Spanish had set up an ambush. The pirates had to draw their cutlasses and cut off vegetation to prevent themselves from sinking into the swamp, all the while being unable to see or hear each other from the smoke and Spanish cannonballs whistling by them. They finally reached one of the fortifications, where the Spanish fired upon them and sallied out, but were forced back by the pirates. A standstill ensued, the pirates unable to take the trenches, and the Spanish not daring to attack. Arne decided to employ a ruse. He made a fake retreat, drawing the Spaniards out of their comfort, after which he counterattacked. The Buccaneers fired a mass volley, drew their cutlasses, and charged the hapless enemy. Using their bodies as ladders, they scaled the defenses, forcing the rest to retreat. These they pursued into the woodlands, butchering them as they went. They entered Gibraltar, where they forced the prisoners into the church, and constructed their own breastwork to defend against a possible counterattack, which never came. The battle was over. That was quite an epic engagement. A good story, but it might have been just that. It was recorded by Exquemelin, a veteran of Morgan's Panama campaign, but one who never sailed with Lolone. It is likely indicative of some of the tactics and means of fighting deployed by the Buccaneers, but we can be fairly certain that this particular engagement did not go down this way, since it disagrees so heavily with the Spanish records. Let's take a look at them instead. They say that Arne did not make his first landing at Gibraltar, but attempted instead Puerto de las Barbacoas, 20 miles away. His intention was to use this spot as a staging ground to flank Gibraltar, but he met with resistance from Para-Aute auxiliaries. As the pirates rowed for the shore, the Para-Aute archers pelted the canoes with a storm of arrows, terrifying them so much that they fled back to their ships. Arne was forced to do a direct assault. As the fleet approached the settlement, the batteries opened fire, starting an artillery duel that would last for a whole 8 days. It was one of the bloodiest battles involving Buccaneers. About 40 crewmen were killed and 30 wounded, but the defenders suffered even heavier casualties. After a few days, corpses littered the streets, the buildings damaged. Among the casualties was the governor, anonymous to Exquemelin, but known to the Spanish as Gabriel Guerrero de Sandoval. His death had a significant effect on morale, and the Spanish decided to abandon their homes. As the Buccaneers made landfall, they were able to occupy the town without any resistance. A vanguard was sent out into the countryside, occupying a ranch where they tortured 2 of the guards. These revealed the location of the town's hidden treasures, taking silver, valuables, and a significant number of slaves. They spent the rest of the month occupying the town, torturing the locals to discover more treasure, raping women, some of whom prostituted themselves for food. The pirates refused to feed their prisoners. There was plenty of flour, but the pirates were too lazy to bake, sustaining themselves entirely on meat. So when the prisoners began to starve, they fed the mules and donkeys, dining themselves on chicken, pigs, cows, and sheep. It was customary for pre-modern armies to demand a ransom for the cities they captured, usually amassed by the denizens to prevent their homes from being burned. The people of Gibraltar were unable to pay the ransom, and at the end of July 1666, the pirates put the city to the torch. They also burned a shipyard, from which they captured 2 prizes, one of which became Oloney's new flagship. They returned to Maracaibo, finding that the denizens had returned. They threatened to burn the city, demanding a ransom in return. The people were unable to pay in money, but offered instead a herd of 500 cattle. It took almost 10 days to assemble, deliver, and slaughter the cows. They had to be cut and preserved on the spot, lest they rot in the climate. Bad weather further delayed the departure, and the fleet could not leave until late September. I included Oloney's taking of Maracaibo to highlight the ambiguity of pirate history, how often the facts were twisted, and how difficult it is to know what happened and didn't. There is so much that went unsaid. The fact that Morgan had a witch with him to Panama was only ever mentioned on the side by a Spanish prisoner. Who knows what other weird things the Buccaneers did, and interesting figures brought with them. Furthermore, Oloney's artillery duel with the city of Gibraltar is very unusual for the Buccaneers, who preferred to make landfall and storm a target. Although the Buccaneers were able to defeat the Spaniard in pitched battles, their preferred method was to take a target without a fight, by surprising them. The sack of Veracruz in 1683 is a masterful and terrifying example of such a conquest. In 1683, a Dutch slave trader named Nicholas van Hoorn was cheated of his cargo by Spanish customers, which in turn was a retaliation against piracies committed by another Dutch pirate, Laurens de Graaf. Both Van Hoorn and de Graaf were serving the French, and Van Hoorn soon acquired a letter of reprisal from the governor of Petit Goave. This document allowed him to claim recompense from the Spanish by means of force. Nicholas joined forces with the Chevalier de Grammont, and the two assembled a filibuster army. At the island of Roatan, they additionally joined forces with Laurens de Graaf, and their force soon numbered 13 vessels and some 1,400 men, one of the largest buccaneer armies of the period. However, the company was not without its issues. Nicholas was far from a people person, nor was he experienced, and true power lay in the hands of the brilliant and charismatic Grammont. Laurens had only joined the fleet because he had been cheated of 2 prizes by Nicholas, and was only there reluctantly. The filibusters decided to target the city of Veracruz, which was Mexico's most prominent port back in the day. It was where the treasure fleet picked up its tribute from the region, and was loaded with riches and affluent people. Many of them were slaveholders, and some of the Buccaneers had been slaves in the city, such as John Russell. They would now serve the company as guides. The ostentatious populace had grown decadent, and allowed their defenses to slacken. Though surrounded by once impressive walls, they had now decayed and been piled up by sand dunes, scalable from the outside. The locals had primarily relied on the sheer size of the city and population to deter any pirate attacks, and grown complacent. On the 17th of May, 1683, the governor was attending a lavish feast when he received a report of 2 ships approaching the harbor. The governor dismissed it. An Irish inhabitant of the city, John Murphy, later told him that the ships were acting strangely, but the governor told him that they were surely scouts of the expected treasure fleet. Later on, the fort commander advised him to put the city on high alert, and the governor complied. 300 soldiers were deployed to their barracks, but the 400-strong militia was not alerted. At night, he visited each of the barracks to comfort his men, ordered sentries along the waterline, before going back to bed. The 2 ships were the Graaf's scouting vessels. Having found the coast undefended, the Graaf disembarked with 200 men, the forlorn hope. Guided by John Russell, they advanced on the city. They were actually spotted by 3 horsemen, but these were too scared to alert the city, allowing the forlorn to climb the sand dunes and into the city. Some of the Spanish-speaking filibusters had dressed up as locals and found the sentinels asleep. Grammont and Van Hoorn came next, landing the main force of 600, and followed the Graaf's footsteps into the darkened streets. In silence, they split the company into smaller units and dispersed around the city. When the sun began to rise at 4 a.m., a Spanish lookout was alerted by someone climbing his ladder. The man asked for a light, and then shot the lookout dead. That was the signal. The governor woke up to the sound of gunfire. He hastened down the stairs with a sword and baton to rally his household company, but they lacked ammunition. Outside, Grammont personally led 2 columns of 80 filibusters to seize the governor's mansion. The bravest of the defenders managed to form a line in the street, but 3 rapid volleys from the filibusters forced them to retreat. The survivors fled inside the mansion and barred the door. The governor ran upstairs with his troops, emerging from a balcony to call for quarter. A soldier warned him, quote, not to do so with a naked blade in his hand, for he might be killed, unquote. The governor pulled back into his office, where he tried to dispose of his official papers by throwing them into the well. He didn't want to leave any evidence as to his identity. He joined his panic-stricken men on the rooftop. They escaped across the walls and into the adjacent residences. The Buccaneers cut off his escape, but the governor was gone. A few days later, they found him hiding in the stables with a wounded leg. John Murphy was holed up in his residence when the gunfire started. It was a fine, 2-story house with over a dozen slaves, where Murphy lived with his wife and 6 children. The Buccaneers' guide, John Russell, was calling out from the street. If Murphy opened up, he would be given quarter. If not, his throat would be cut. Russell was a former logwood cutter, captured by the Spanish and purchased by Murphy as a convict laborer, allowing him to work off his sentence and now seeking vengeance. He was not the only one. Other ex-prisoners tracked down and murdered Don Pedro Estrada, a member of the Holy Inquisition. Another filibuster, a former inhabitant of the city, tracked down and murdered his wife. Murphy armed 14 of his black servants with swords and lances, and as the filibusters entered the darkness of the home, the slaves ambushed and killed 3 of them. The rest escaped. Murphy's victory was short-lived, and when more of the raiders arrived, he surrendered. The Buccaneers promised that his captivity would be painful. When morning became day, the 6,000 residents were herded like cattle into the biggest church. For days they would be left there without food, water, or proper facilities for going to the bathroom. Occasionally, someone was dragged out to be interrogated, abused, or raped. Murphy was suspended from a scaffold in the main square, and left to hang until he confessed the location of his loot. However, with his home ransacked, he was left penniless. The Buccaneers did not believe him, and Lawrence almost killed him. Indeed, the city was ransacked of everything of value, while the commanders attempted contact with neighboring colonies to demand a ransom. They prepared defenses, and Grammont organized a 100-man cavalry troop from stolen horses. When Spanish cavalry was spotted, they rode out under flag and trumpet, scaring the enemy off. With the treasure fleet soon to arrive, the Buccaneers evacuated the prisoners to the nearby Isla de Sacrificios, where they kept them under deplorable conditions. No word came of the ransom, and disputes arose between the impatient Buccaneers. The conflict between Lawrence and Nicholas finally came to a head when Lawrence defeated Nicholas in a short duel. The loser died a few weeks later of sepsis. The day after the duel, the ransom arrived, and the Buccaneers left, releasing most of the locals, apart from 1,500 people of color who were enslaved, regardless of their former status. Murphy returned home to find his house ruined, his wife murdered. One of his daughters passed away 3 weeks later. The attack on Veracruz was a stroke of genius, one of the wealthiest colonial cities taken without a single casualty. By using people knowledgeable of the target, disguises, darkness, discipline and charisma, the city was won. But it was as much reliant on the defenders' laziness and complacency. Had the risk of a potential attack been taken seriously and the defenses tended to, and had the governor taken the warnings to heart, the situation might have looked entirely different. It was a hard lesson, for it showed what brutalities the Buccaneers could inflict if the Spanish were not prepared. Veracruz was a wake-up call. Across the Caribbean, defenses were improved, and pirate hunters took to the offense. Some of the cruelest perpetrators were eventually captured, taken to trial, and hung in the main square. Nicholas died of sepsis from the duel, Gramont perished in a storm, and Lawrence lost his fortune some 15 years later, when the Spanish allied with the English and burned his plantation, possibly freeing some of the slaves he had taken in Veracruz. No list of great land battles fought by pirates is complete without the Battle of Arica. It is certainly the most well-documented engagement ever fought by pirates, and arguably the most dramatic episode of their golden age. It is a story worth remembering. Arica was a small and humble town on the dry coast of modern-day Chile, but one of the most important embarcaderos of the Spanish Empire. It was here that they stored the silver from the mountain of Potosi, before the galleons took it onwards to Europe. The silver allowed Spain to wage its devastating campaigns of aggression across the home continent, and if this town of short and flat-roof buildings would somehow fall, the pulsing artery of the empire would sever and bleed. In 1679, a small army of buccaneers entered the Pacific via the Isthmus of Darien. Many of them were veterans of Morgan and had dreamt of doing so after the Panama campaign. The Spanish Pacific held untold riches, but had not been visited by Englishmen since the voyage of Francis Drake. However, the company did not meet with much success. After the death of their much-loved Richard Sawkins, the less popular Bartholomew Sharp assumed command. Sharp was more cautious than was expected of Buccaneer commanders, and his tendency to gamble over money with his men, and win, made them resent him. Sharp was eventually betrayed by one of his lieutenants, John Cox, and replaced by John Watling. Shortly after the mutiny, Watling had to escape from 3 Spanish ships, and he now ran the risk of being seen as a coward. With his life and captaincy on the line, he needed to score it big, and set his sights on Arica. However, when 2 old men told him that the city was prepared for them, Watling called one of them a liar and had him shot. According to legend, Bartholomew Sharp then washed his hands, saying, "Gentlemen, I am clear of the blood of this old man, and I will warrant you a hot day for this piece of cruelty, whenever we come to fight at Arica." Watling snarled and gave a prophecy of his own, the sum of which being that either he would have Arica or Arica would have him. Watling was wrong, and Arica was indeed prepared for his coming. The town itself was well suited for defending, being shaped like a square in a grid layout, with straight, predictable streets and the church of San Marcos at its center. The houses were never higher than 11 feet and had flat roofs, excellent positions for sharpshooters. At the western corner of the town stood a small fort, armed with 12 cannons. Its weakness was the high hill to the south, giving any attacker a high ground to fire at the fort from. Additionally, the Ariqueños had constructed a breastwork around the town, a trenchwork of sorts, and barricades were built in every street. If one was taken, the defenders could pull back to the next. How many they were we do not know for certain, 700 at most, but possibly much fewer. They were merchants, artisans, and laborers of primarily African, native, and mixed ancestry, all of them volunteers, with only 110 firearms available, the rest armed with javelins, slings, or the spear and shield. Every one of them had a coca leaf stuck in his cheek, staving off the hunger and keeping their energy high. The Buccaneers made landfall on the 30th of January, the day that Charles I was beheaded. The royalists among them saw it as an omen, the Puritans as a stroke of fortune. A few men were left behind to mind the boats, leaving Watling with a mere 92, making this the smallest Buccaneer force on our list. They were divided into 2 companies, the first ordered to attack the fort, the second the town itself. The day soon became hot, and the march close to unbearable. Not one defender was seen, and Watling was sure that he had the element of surprise. The silhouettes of 3 horsemen were seen at the top of the hill. Without any sound or flare, they turned about and disappeared. All surprise had been lost. Watling ordered his company to seize the hill and attack the fort. They mounted the top of the hill and fired at the defenders and threw down grenades. In between the explosions, they exchanged shouts and insults with the garrison. Meanwhile, the second company marched towards the town and found the Ariqueños waiting for them in the open field. The Ariqueños fired first, and the Buccaneers made a push, finding themselves outgunned. Then, a cry came from the hill on the left flank. "They run! They run!" They were being relieved by Watling's company, charging down the hill and firing at the Ariqueños, forcing them to retreat back to the breastworks. With the companies united as one, the fort fired its cannons at them. The Buccaneers were now caught between the breastworks and the castle, and had no option but to push. A handful managed to outflank the breastwork, and fired down the entire line. It was near impossible to miss, and they loaded their fusées with a bullet and 7 or 9 swan shot. Think an overcharged shotgun round. When the main force stormed the trench, the defenders quickly surrendered. Watling decided to take them with him as prisoners, although his men complained. They had no time to argue, as fire came from the rooftops and barricades. Once more, the company split up. Watling went east, aiming to outflank the defenders, while the second company pushed into the streets. As urban combat often is, it was absolutely brutal, with Basil Ringrose, a participant, writing the following. "Our rage increasing with our wounds, we still advanced, and at last beat the enemy out of all, and filled every street in the city with dead bodies." Whenever the Buccaneers took a barricade, the defenders just retreated to the next. Casualties and wounds were stacking, as were the prisoners Watling had forced them to take. Soon there were more prisoners than Buccaneers. The Buccaneers had enough, and anyone asking for quarter was executed. The butchery had begun, and another participant, John Cox, excused the massacre by saying it was done against people of mixed origins, a race he considered naturally cruel. The town had been captured, and the Buccaneers set up a hospital inside a church of the central plaza. The surgeons were to tend the wounded, but found communion wine and got drunk instead. Meanwhile, Watling had located a storehouse of Potosi silver, and he could have carried it back to the landing and made himself and his men set for life. But since their flagship carried no artillery, he wanted to loot it from the fort and decided to attack. He sent an envoy asking them to surrender, but the captain refused. Watling deployed the many prisoners as a meat shield, marching them in front of the Buccaneer advance. Undeterred, the defenders fired on both, and when close enough, a secret sally port opened, allowing the meat shields to spring into safety. Some were left out when the port shut, and the Buccaneers killed them. Standing under the safety of the walls, the Buccaneers threw grenades over, but these were in poor quality and did no damage. A few managed to occupy a house, got up on the rooftop, and sniped a few defenders. The assault had ground to a halt, allowing reinforcements to retake the urban barricades and reoccupy the city. Watling ordered a desperate retreat back to the church. Both of his quartermasters were killed, and he was shot in his loins. As his men dragged him to the central plaza, he bled out. The day had indeed turned very hot, and Sharp's prophecy had come true. Well inside the church, the surgeons were found pissed drunk, and refusing to work or go with their comrades. Some men were so reduced to thirst that they began drinking their own piss, and a captured Spaniard told them that if they would go with him, he would show them a place where there was more money than they could carry. In their desperation, the Buccaneers had no option but to beg Bat Sharp to reassume command and save them. He had no choice. It was then that their luck began to turn. All of the gunfire from the muskets and cannons had summoned up a great cloud of smoke, blending with the uprooted dust of the sandy streets. Sharp mustered his men, and using the smoke as cover, they exited the city, the Ariqueños hot on their heels. Well out on the open plain, the Buccaneers reformed, scaring their enemy back to the breastwork. Sharp then organized his men into a circular formation, the wounded in the center. Not a moment too soon, for they were soon attacked by cavalry. By not firing all at once, and having a man at every angle, the formation was easily able to repel the horsemen, even if they were outranged by their rifled carbines. Fearing fire from the fort, the formation pushed down to the shoreline and moved southward to the landing. The defenders amassed on the hill above them, throwing down spears and huge stones. The general sat on his horse upon the heights, waving a white handkerchief while crying out to his men, "Valientes soldados, buena, valientes soldados." The Buccaneers tried birding him, but he was well out of range. Meanwhile, the Ariqueños had captured and interrogated the surgeons left behind in the church. They had figured out the Buccaneers' signaling system and fired up 2 pillars of smoke, signaling for the boats to retreat. The retreating Buccaneers made it back to their landing just in time. The boats had already set sail and were ready to leave. Had they done so, Sharp's men would have been abandoned and slaughtered to a man. In a lone corner of Arica, a solitary Buccaneer made his last stand. He had been a slave brought from Jamaica and later freed by Bartholomew Sharp. Now they had left him behind, and the Spanish were all around him. One of his legs had been shot off, and the Spaniards offered him quarter. He supposed that if he surrendered, they would likely enslave him again, owing to the color of his skin. In the end, he managed to take down 5 of them, before the Buccaneers had sustained 28 casualties and 17 wounded. They themselves never learned how many Ariqueños they killed, but Spanish accounts report 23 dead and an unknown amount of wounded. Perhaps the Buccaneers' accounts were a bit overdramatic, or the Spanish account excluded the deaths of slaves or non-white volunteers. The battle had lasted for 7 hours, and the Buccaneers departed at 10 in the evening. The Buccaneers lived to fight another day, but many of them could not stand the sight of Captain Sharp and left the company. He and his men were unable to capture any other significant prizes, and after a few months, left the Pacific. The Battle of Arica was not a grand engagement of hundreds, thousands of men. It was basically a glorified street fight. However, its build-up, aftermath, and the battle itself is one of the most intense, dramatic, and personal episodes from the period, wrought with betrayals, twists, and turns. I am glad that you waited so patiently through this episode to see it to its end, for this last chapter is truly a story worth retelling. At the end of December, I intend to publish a Q&A video, so if you have any questions directed towards me, the channel, or anything in general, feel free to post it in the comments by email or Discord, and I will see if I can answer it in the December video. Maybe Santa is going to be generous. Until then. A lot of you watching engage in various forms of creative endeavors, ranging from novel writing to game design. Some of you have expressed interest or contacted me for consultation in your projects. So with the advice from one of my clients, I have set up a Fiverr account where you can now hire me to consult on your project. I offer research, proofreading, editing, and critique. Or we can just spitball ideas. You'll find a link in the video description or pinned comment below. Otherwise, support Gold Gunpowder by liking the video, giving your thoughts on the video, subscribing, and clicking the notification bell. Monetarily by buying some merch or becoming a Patreon supporter, where $1 a month gets you early, ad-free, and sponsor-free access to my videos.